There is a fundamental misunderstanding about what it means to break someone. The culture has built an entire language around it. Words like shattered, destroyed, damaged, ruined. And embedded inside all of that language is a single, unchallenged assumption. That breaking is the end of something. That when a person has been brought to their knees by pain, by betrayal, by loss, by the slow and deliberate erosion of everything they believed about themselves and the people they trusted, what remains is less. A diminished version. A wounded copy of the original. And for a long time, she believed that too. That's the misunderstanding. And it's worth examining carefully, because the psychology underneath it tells an entirely different story. Most people move through life building their identity the way you build a house, layer by layer, room by room, adding walls and ceilings and carefully chosen furniture until the structure feels solid enough to live in. For many people, those walls are made of external things. The relationships that confirm their worth. The roles they occupy, daughter, partner, caretaker, the reliable one, the one who always shows up. The image that others hold of them, the reputation they've maintained, the version of themselves they've presented so consistently that they've stopped distinguishing it from who they actually are. This is not weakness. This is human. It is how most people survive the uncertainty of being alive. You build something stable enough to stand on, and you stay there. But empaths build differently. And this matters because it changes everything about what happens when the structure falls. Empaths don't just attach to people, they attune to them. They don't just love, they absorb. They carry the emotional weather of the people closest to them the way other people carry memories. They orient their entire internal world around connection, around being needed, around the particular kind of purpose that comes from being the person who understands, who holds space, who makes sense of things for the people they love. This is not a flaw. It is a form of extraordinary depth. But it means that when the connection breaks, when the person they organize themselves around reveals themselves to be unsafe or dishonest or incapable of the reciprocity she gave so freely, what collapses is not just the relationship. What collapses is the architecture of her entire self-concept. That is why it feels like annihilation, because functionally it is. And here is where the misunderstanding deepens. Because when people watch an empath go through this kind of collapse, when they witness the silence, the withdrawal, the way she stops performing the version of herself everyone was comfortable with, they read it as damage. They call it falling apart. They offer the language of recovery, as though what she needs is to be reassembled into what she was before. But that framing contains a critical error. It assumes that what broke was worth preserving. It assumes that the structure that collapsed was the real her, rather than the carefully constructed accommodation she had built over years of prioritizing everyone else's comfort above her own truth. There are two kinds of breaking. This distinction is the entire foundation of what comes next, so it is worth sitting with. There is the breaking of what you actually are, the core of a person, their values, their awareness, their capacity to feel and perceive and know. And then there is the breaking of what you were pretending to be, the performance, the endless softening of edges, the habitual self-erasure that had become so automatic she had stopped recognizing it as a choice, the overgiving that she had dressed up as love, the silences she kept to maintain peace in relationships that were quietly feeding on her. When life brings the kind of pain that brings an empath to her lowest point, it is almost never the first kind of breaking that happens. It is the second. What breaks is the false structure. What survives is the truth. This is not a comfortable reframe. It doesn't make the pain smaller. It doesn't make the betrayal less real or the loss less sharp. But it changes the meaning of what she is experiencing. And meaning in the depths of genuine suffering is not a luxury. It is the difference between a person who emerges and a person who doesn't. Because if she believes she is broken in the first sense, that what is essential about her has been destroyed, she will spend her energy trying to recover what was never worth keeping. But if she understands what actually broke, she will do something else entirely. She will let it go. She will stop trying to rebuild the house that was never built on solid ground to begin with. And she will start, for the first time, building from truth. That distinction between what broke and what survived is everything. There is something that happens to an empath in pain that doesn't happen to most people. And understanding it is the key to understanding why the women who break the hardest are often the ones who rise the furthest. It is not poetic. It is not a comfort offered to make suffering feel meaningful. It is a psychological reality, one that most people never examine closely enough to see clearly. And it begins with a simple but profound difference in how an empath experiences the moment of breaking itself. Most people, when they are hurt deeply enough, contract. It is a survival mechanism as old as the nervous system itself. When the world proves unsafe, the natural response is to become less open to it, to feel less, to perceive less, to build internal distance between the self and the source of pain. And over time, if the pain is significant enough, this contraction becomes structural. It becomes the new default. They stop trusting as easily. They stop feeling as freely. They stop allowing themselves the vulnerability that made the wound possible in the first place. This is not cynicism. This is adaptation. The psyche doing what it was designed to do, protecting the organism from repeated damage. But an empath cannot do this cleanly. And that inability, which feels like a curse in the middle of the pain, is the hidden source of everything that comes after. Because an empath's awareness does not have an off switch. Her sensitivity does not numb on command. She cannot decide to feel less and simply feel less. She cannot choose to perceive less and have the perception comply. When the person she trusted reveals themselves to have been something other than what she believed, she does not experience just the surface of that betrayal, the facts of what happened, the timeline, the specific failures. She experiences all of it, the layers beneath the event, the pattern behind the person, the dynamic she sensed long before she was willing to name it, the dissonance she explained away 100 times because the alternative felt too costly, the truth she felt in her body months or years before she allowed herself to think it consciously. This is what makes the empath's breaking so complete. She doesn't just lose the person. She loses the story. The entire internal narrative she had constructed about who this person was, about what the relationship meant, about what her own love was capable of building, collapses simultaneously. And underneath the collapse is something even more disorienting. She begins to question her own perception. She wonders how she could have felt so much and still missed so much. How she could have been so attuned and still been so wrong. This is the particular cruelty of the empath's grief. It doesn't just break her heart. It temporarily breaks her trust in her own knowing. And for someone whose greatest gift has always been the ability to sense what is true, that disorientation is its own specific kind of devastation. But here is what most people never see, because they stop watching when the breaking begins. They assume the story is over. They don't stay long enough to witness what happens in the silence that follows. When the grief has moved through enough of its own weight, when the disorientation begins to settle, something starts to emerge. Not immediately, not cleanly, but inevitably, because an empath's awareness, the same awareness that couldn't be switched off during the pain, cannot be switched off during the aftermath either. It keeps working. It keeps processing. It keeps moving through every layer of what happened, refusing to stop at the surface explanation, refusing to accept the comfortable version, pressing deeper and deeper until it reaches the bottom of the truth. And at the bottom of the truth is always clarity, not the false clarity of bitterness, which is just pain that has hardened into a story. Real clarity, the kind that comes from having felt every inch of something and understood it completely. She begins to see the patterns, not just in the person who hurt her, but in herself, in the choices she made, in the places she overrode her own perception to preserve the relationship, in the specific ways she made herself smaller to fit inside someone else's limitations, in the things she tolerated not because they were acceptable, but because she had been quietly taught that her comfort was negotiable, and that seeing that full, unsparing, deeply felt recognition is not more damage. It is the beginning of something that has no accurate name except this: becoming. This is why empaths don't break the way ordinary people break. They break deeper. They feel further into the wound than most people are willing to go. But depth, in the end, is not the enemy of recovery. Depth is the mechanism of transformation, because you cannot understand what you have only grazed the surface of. And she does not graze surfaces. She never has. That was always her power. The pain simply directed it inward, toward the one place she had been too busy giving to properly look. That is ground zero, not rock bottom. Ground zero, the place where everything false has been cleared, and what remains is only what is real. There is a period that comes after the breaking that nobody talks about honestly. Not because it is secret, but because it is invisible. From the outside, it looks like stillness. It looks like withdrawal. It looks like a woman who has gone quiet in ways that concern the people around her, who has stopped performing the social rituals that once made her easy to be around, who seems to be doing nothing except existing inside her own silence. And because the culture has no framework for productive darkness, because stillness is almost always misread as stagnation, the people watching will often try to pull her out of it. They will call it depression. They will call it giving up. They will offer advice designed to return her to the version of herself they were comfortable with. But what they cannot see, because it is happening beneath every surface, is that she is not idle. She is being rebuilt from the inside out. And the process is more precise, more total, and more permanent than anything that could happen in the light. Psychology has a name for what begins in this darkness: post-traumatic growth. Not simply the absence of damage, not merely the restoration of a previous baseline, but measurable, documented, qualitative increases in strength, clarity, and capacity that emerge specifically because of severe adversity, not in spite of it. Research consistently shows that people who move through genuine crisis and allow themselves to fully process it, rather than bypassing it, come out the other side with fundamentally altered perception, increased tolerance for uncertainty, deeper empathy, sharper discernment, a recalibrated understanding of what matters and what never did. This is not a metaphor. This is what happens to the human psyche when it is forced all the way through something instead of around it. And for an empath, whose baseline sensitivity was already operating at a level most people never reach, this rewiring is not incremental. It is seismic. The first thing that changes is her relationship with dishonesty. Not just the obvious kind, not just the lies people tell out loud, but the subtle, ambient dishonesty that most social environments are built on. The performative agreements. The things people say to manage each other's emotions rather than to tell the truth. The unspoken contracts that keep relationships functional at the cost of keeping them real. Before the breaking, she tolerated these things. She participated in them, even. She softened her perception to fit inside spaces that couldn't hold the full weight of what she saw. She edited her observations, moderated her responses, chose peace over accuracy so many times that it had become reflex. But something in the darkness recalibrates that tolerance to near zero. She finds, emerging on the other side, that she can no longer pretend not to notice what she notices. That the energy required to perform unawareness has become a cost she is no longer willing to pay. This is not harshness. This is integrity taking form. The second thing that changes is deeper and harder to articulate. It is the dissolution of the compulsion to overgive. For most empaths, excessive giving is not a conscious choice. It is a pattern so old it feels like personality. It feels like love. It feels like the natural expression of who she is, this orientation toward others, this impulse to help carry what people are struggling with, this almost involuntary movement toward whoever is in pain. And in many ways it is love. But underneath the love, if she is honest enough to look, there has always been something else. A belief, absorbed long before she had the language to question it, that her value was located in her usefulness, that she earned her place in relationships by giving more than she received, that the way to keep people close was to make herself indispensable to their emotional survival. The darkness, in its brutal efficiency, surfaces that belief completely. She sees it clearly, perhaps for the first time, not as love, but as a wound dressed in love's clothing. And once it is seen that clearly, it cannot be unseen. The third change is the one that will define everything that comes after. She stops running from her own silence. Before the breaking, solitude for many empaths carries a particular discomfort. The absence of the external emotional world they have always used to orient themselves. Without someone to attune to, without a relationship to tend, without the constant hum of other people's inner lives to process, there is a silence that can feel disorienting, even threatening. But in the darkness, in the weeks and months of involuntary stillness that the breaking forces upon her, she begins to discover something that changes the entire structure of her inner life. She discovers that the silence is not empty, that inside it, beneath all the noise of other people's needs and emotions she had been carrying for so long, there is a voice that is entirely her own, unhurried, unedited, clear in a way that nothing in her relational world had ever quite been. And the longer she sits with it, the more she realizes that this voice was always there. She had simply been too busy giving herself away to hear it. This is the hidden curriculum of the darkness. Not punishment, not stagnation, not the absence of progress. The darkness is where she finally meets herself, not the version constructed for other people's comfort, not the one shaped by years of accommodation and self-erasure, but the original, the one that existed before the world taught her that her needs were secondary, that her boundaries were inconvenient, that her perception was too much for the people around her to hold. She isn't waiting to be healed in that silence. She is becoming someone who no longer needs what broke her. There is a moment, not dramatic, not announced, not marked by anything the outside world would recognize as significant, when she begins to move again, not back toward what she was, not in the direction of recovery. If recovery means returning to the person she was before the pain, she moves forward. And the first thing most people notice is that she is different in ways they cannot quite name, but cannot quite ignore either. She is quieter than she used to be. She takes longer to respond. She does not fill silences the way she once did, rushing to smooth over discomfort, to say the thing that makes everyone in the room feel settled. She lets silences exist. She lets people sit in their own discomfort without immediately moving to absorb it. And the people who knew her before, the ones who were used to the version of her that was always available, always attuned, always one step ahead of everyone else's emotional needs, will feel that difference as a kind of distance. They will call it coldness. They will say she has changed and mean it as a criticism, as though the person she was before was the correct version and this one is a deviation. What they are actually responding to is the removal of everything that made her manageable. And that is worth sitting with, because it reveals something important, not about her, but about what people had come to expect from her. When someone who has spent years being endlessly available, endlessly understanding, endlessly willing to set herself aside for the comfort of others suddenly stops doing those things, it is experienced by the people around her as a withdrawal of something they were entitled to. Not a gift she had been giving, an entitlement they had come to rely on. The resentment that sometimes surfaces in those people, the subtle withdrawal of warmth, the reframing of her new boundaries as selfishness, the quiet disapproval of her refusal to return to form, is not a response to who she has become. It is a response to what she is no longer willing to be. But she sees it now. That is the difference. The woman who emerged from the darkness sees the dynamic with a clarity that the woman who entered it did not possess. She understands, with a precision that is almost structural, the difference between people who were drawn to her and people who were drawn to what she provided. She can feel the difference in a conversation within minutes, the quality of attention someone brings, whether they are interested in her or interested in what she can do for their emotional state, whether the connection is mutual or whether she is simply the most convenient source of a thing they need. This discernment is not suspicion. It is not the hardness of someone who has been hurt and closed themselves off. It is intelligence, the specific, lived, hard-earned intelligence that comes from having paid the full price of its absence. She is harder to access now, not because she has become cold, but because she has become honest about what access to her actually means. She has learned, at real cost, that she is not a resource to be drawn from without limit, that her attention is not an inexhaustible supply available to anyone who presents themselves as needing it, that her empathy, which is genuine and deep and not diminished by what she has been through, is not an obligation. It is a choice. And she has become very deliberate about where she directs it. The people who receive her full presence now, the real presence, not the performed version, not the carefully managed attunement she once offered almost indiscriminately. Those people are receiving something extraordinary. Because what she brings to connection now is not the anxious generosity of someone trying to earn her place. It is the grounded, chosen, fully conscious gift of someone who knows exactly what she is offering and has decided that the person in front of her is worth it. Her silence is different now too. Before the breaking, her silence was often suppression. The things she noticed but didn't say, the perceptions she kept to herself to avoid disrupting the peace, the truths she swallowed because the relationship couldn't hold them. Now her silence is selection. She is not holding back out of fear. She is choosing, with full awareness, what deserves her words and what is not. She has stopped over-explaining herself to people who are committed to misunderstanding her. She has stopped offering her interior world to people who have demonstrated they will not handle it with care. She has stopped performing openness as a social obligation. And in place of all that performed transparency, there's something that reads as mystery to people who don't understand it, a quality of self-containment, of depth held privately, of presence that is fully inhabited rather than constantly displayed. What looks like walls from the outside is, from the inside, finally knowing the difference between a door and a wound. The people who try to provoke her now find that the old entry points no longer work. The guilt that once moved her so reliably, the implication that she was being selfish, that she was failing someone, that her boundaries were a form of abandonment, lands differently now. She feels it. She is not numb to it, but she can hold it at a distance long enough to examine it honestly, to ask whether the guilt belongs to her or whether it is being placed on her by someone whose access she has limited. And most of the time, when she examines it clearly, she finds that the guilt is not hers. It is the discomfort of someone who has lost the ability to manage her, and she lets it exist without being governed by it. That is not indifference. That is one of the most profound forms of emotional maturity a human being can develop, the ability to feel a feeling fully without being controlled by it. She is not who she was before the pain, but she is, for the first time, entirely who she is. There is a word that gets used carelessly: unstoppable. It gets attached to ambition, to relentless drive, to the kind of high-performance energy that the culture celebrates. The person who wakes up early and works late and refuses to quit and displays their resilience like a trophy. And that version of unstoppable is real in its way. But it is not what she has become. What she has become is something quieter and something far more dangerous to every dynamic that ever tried to diminish her. Because her unstoppability is not located in her drive. It is not a product of her ambition or her discipline or her refusal to feel pain. It is located in something that most people spend their entire lives never fully developing. It is located in her alignment. And alignment, once genuinely achieved, is one of the most unassailable states a human being can inhabit. Most people move through the world carrying a gap. It exists between who they actually are and who they present themselves to be, between what they genuinely feel and what they allow themselves to express, between the truth they perceive and the version of that truth they are willing to speak out loud. This gap is not always conscious. In many cases, it is so old, so thoroughly normalized, that the person carrying it has stopped noticing it as a gap at all. It has simply become the texture of daily life, the slight performance required in every interaction, the management of how one is perceived, the careful editing of the self to fit inside the expectations of the people and environments that surround them. And this gap, invisible as it often is, creates a specific and permanent vulnerability. Because anything built on the maintenance of a false image can be threatened by exposure. Anyone operating from a performed identity can be destabilized by the possibility of being truly seen. She no longer has that gap, not because she is perfect, Not because she has resolved every complexity of her own character or arrived at some final, unchanging version of herself, but because she has already survived the worst version of being exposed. She has already been seen at her most raw, her most desperate, her most completely undone. She has already lost the image, the role, the carefully constructed version of herself she once believed she needed in order to be loved. And she survived it. And what she found on the other side of that survival was not the diminished, damaged version of herself that the breaking seemed to promise. She found that what remained, after the performance was stripped away, after the accommodation was dissolved, after the false structures had finished collapsing, was more than enough. Was, in fact, the only thing that had ever been real. This is why she is unstoppable. Not because nothing can touch her. Things still touch her. She is still an empath. She still feels the full weight of the world with the same depth and sensitivity that she always has. The pain did not take that from her. Nothing could take that from her, because it is not a product of her circumstances. It is the structure of her perception. But pain no longer has the power to define her. It no longer has the power to rewrite her understanding of her own worth. Because she has already written that story. She lived through the chapter where everything was taken, and she knows how it ends. She knows what survives. And that knowledge, not as a concept, not as something she read or was told, but as a lived, embodied, paid-for truth, is a foundation that cannot be destabilized from the outside. Because it was built entirely from the inside. The people who tried to break her, whether through deliberate cruelty or through the careless damage of their own unresolved wounds, made a miscalculation that is almost elegant in its irony. They assumed that what they were targeting was the source of her strength, her openness, her depth of feeling, her willingness to love without armor. They assumed that if they could exhaust those things, if they could make her feel foolish enough for having offered them, she would contract into something smaller and easier to manage. But they were targeting the expression of her strength, not its source. Her source was always her awareness, her perception, her absolute inability to stop seeing clearly, even when clarity was the most painful thing available. And that, no matter what they did, they could not touch. They could not break what they could not reach. And they could never reach what she has always carried at the deepest level of herself. There is a final truth to this that does not become visible until you hold the entire arc together. The breaking, the darkness, the rewiring, the emergence. And look at what the journey has actually produced. She is not the same person who entered the pain. She is not a healed version of that person, restored to factory settings, patched up and sent back out. She is someone new, someone forged. And the specific nature of what she has become carries a quality that the person she was before could not have accessed, not because she wasn't worthy of it, but because it can only be built one way. It cannot be taught. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be developed in comfort or constructed in safety. It can only be earned by going all the way through the thing that was supposed to destroy you and discovering, on the other side, that it didn't. That you are still here. That you are still clear. That you are still beneath everything that was stripped away, entirely and unmistakably yourself. They broke her. They just didn't know that breaking was the only path to what she was becoming. She is not who she was before the pain. She is who the pain could not destroy. And that is not recovery. That is arrival. Script complete by full 4,000 words across 5 sections. Here's a quick summary of what was built. The script opens by dismantling the cultural misunderstanding around breaking, moves through the specific psychology of how empaths break differently and more deeply than others, descends into the invisible rewiring that happens in silence, surfaces into who she becomes when she emerges, discerning, boundaried, self-possessed, and closes by defining her unstoppability not as toughness or ambition, but as alignment. The final 3 lines are engineered to dominate the comments section.